And that's good.
Sorry, I'm going to record this. We'll cut the beginning at the end. This is not going to be made public yet. Maybe we will at some point, but it's going to be made available through a closed channel on our YouTube account for those that couldn't attend today.
Okay. Okay.
And we can give people, what, let's say 2 more minutes to join before we get started.
You decide.
Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome.
Welcome.
Che non vedo il chat, non posso salutare a nessuno perché non ho chat per dire, tutti dicono hello, no? Ci siamo, eh?
Sì. Please remember to mute yourselves. Oh, no, I'm not mute.
Ah, eccoci. Puoi venire?
We'll give people 2 more minutes to join. We have lots of people still coming in, and then we can get started. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody.
Welcome.
I'm very curious to know where everyone is calling in from. I mean, if you wouldn't mind, you could just write what city or country you're calling in from in the chat, just for my curious benefit, if you could.
Italy.
Daily. Ah,
Italy in the mountains.
Spain. Ah. Huh.
Okay, it's 5 past. I think we can get started. Very warm welcome, very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're calling from. Welcome to those of you who are joining this course for the first time, and welcome back to those who've been with us already. My name is Pavel Vargan. I am the coordinator of the Secretariat of the Progressive International. I'm very glad to be here with you today. This is the 4th class in our summer school on global capitalism. And we're joined today by a person who I think really needs no introduction. Professor Silvia Federici is calling in from New York. She's a scholar, a teacher, a very accomplished and well-known feminist activist who you're a professor emeritus now, right? At Hofstra University, right? Where you taught in the past. Professor Federici has published many books, including Caliban and the Witch, Wages Against Housework, Birth Work as Care Work, and many others, some of which, as I learned a few days ago, members of this group had studied as part of their university degrees. So I'm sure you're all familiar with Professor Federici's work. Just a couple of words about today's session before we get started. We had a discussion before you all joined today, and Professor Federici would like this to be as interactive as possible. So if you could, and if you would like to speak during the intervention, then I would ask that you just raise your hand to indicate that you would like to ask a question, make a point, share a reflection, and then Professor Federici will call on you to do so when she's ready. The only thing I ask of anyone making an intervention is that you try to speak slowly for the benefit of our dear interpreters who are with us again today. So I think I'll leave it at that. Professor Federici, thank you for joining us again. Thank you for being accommodating, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Good evening, good morning to everybody. And it's fantastic to be here with you and begin this conversation. And my only pain is that, I wish that this conversation went beyond the 2 hours, because I'm going to raise a number of issues. And I would like to also hear, your response to them. And I've asked Pavel to stress that I would like this to be as much as possible interactive, because I'm going to bring a lot of things. I'm going to give a little bit of a history of the conflict between bourgeois and radical revolutionary feminism. But my experience, of course, I understand you're coming from different parts of the world. So there's much that each of you can contribute. So feel free as I'm presenting. Needless to say that we live in very, very difficult, dangerous, terrible times. I cannot remember, maybe back to the Iraq War or even the Vietnam War, the situation today, for example, in Palestine, it's something that is mind-boggling and requires of all of us, really, in a sense, to go back to the basic, to think where the movement going, how we arrived at this point, and what needs to be done. And I would like to keep that frame in mind as we speak, of feminism. I'm going to make a proposition that perhaps will surprise some of you. I want to say that potentially, and I underline that, the feminist movement, an anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, anti-racist feminist movement today would be the kind of movement that has the highest possibility of creating a common ground, of bringing together, coalition of different movement, ecological movement, dealing with healthcare, anti-war, because in a way, the point that I'm going to make is that the feminist movement is a movement that more than any other, in a way, and again, I step potentially because obviously we are speaking of not one feminist movement, but more feminist, but potentially is a movement that is concerned with the question of social reproduction, or what are the conditions for the reproduction of society. And in that way, it touches on all the most important aspects of life. And in that way, it had the possibility of constructing a kind of struggle that is powerfully anti-systemic. Whether it does or not, it's of course a very open question. So I want to say that the conflict, between a feminism that tries to change the condition of women without changing society, but better integrate women in the existing society, and a feminism that does not see any possibility for a substantial change without a social transformation, and therefore connects, the oppression, exploitation of women inseparably to every other form of exploitation and oppression. That conflict, in a way, has existed since the beginning of the feminist movement. Since the beginning, very quickly, historically, we can say, roughly speaking, in Europe at least, feminism begins at the time of the French Revolution, when inspired, and this is a case with every movement. The feminist movement has always surged, in the wake of other movements, the abolitionist movement against slavery, socialist movement, working class movement, the movement against Vietnam and against apartheid. So begins with the French Revolution, the Declaration of Human Rights. And very soon you have feminists who begins to write about the Declaration of the Rights of Women. And, at the time, for instance, women in Europe were still under the law of coverture, which means if you married, you basically stopped being a legal person. You were not a legal person. You were represented from the state always through a male figure, right? And so begins there a kind of middle-class struggle, right, for integration into the society, for being able to have a personal identity, a legal identity, and to enter the public life, to not be excluded by public life, and to have some rights within marriage, which they didn't. For example, custody of children in case of separation, and right to property. Remember that until the mid and even later 19th century in Europe, women did not have the right to the wages which they earned when they had a wage occupation, because it was the husband who pocketed the money. Marx speaks of that, in the first volume of Capital. So this idea, of a declaration of the rights of women basically is that women should have the equal rights with men. And then later in the 19th century, that becomes even more the struggle for the voting rights, right? The struggle for the voting rights. In the United States, you have women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right, who see the suffrage, so the three pillars, the late 18th, 19th century, the three pillars of a kind of middle-class white movement are basically, education, big education, patriarchal relations are seen as a product of culture, of a bad culture. So women be educated toward their rights, equal rights with men, right? Participation in the public sphere, and culminating to all of that, right? The voting rights. Immediately you begin to see a conflict, certainly clear in the United States, when, at the time of the passing of the 15th Amendment in the United States, which gave the voting right to Black men, and the feminists did not support it because it gave priority to Black men, right? So immediately a conflict. And then by the 19th century, you also have the rise of a feminist movement within the anarchist and socialist movement. And this begins a different kind of perspective, which basically sees the problem that women faces, the cause, origin of women's oppression as their exclusion from the sphere of production, of social production. And this exclusion is seen as the cause of disempowerment, because if you don't produce capital, you also do not have the power to destroy, right? So in fact, whereas you have the more called bourgeois women's movement fighting for equal rights, the Equal Rights Amendment, fighting for suffrage, you have on another, the socialist women's movement that are fighting for women entering the factory, joining men, and with the idea that the private sphere that there'll be in a future socialist society, a collectivization, socialization of reproductive forms of work. To be said that even within this movement, right, and here we can think of Alexandra Kollontai, Clara Zetkin, you don't have really a questioning of the private sphere insofar as a sphere of exploitation, right? As a sphere of inequality, yes, but not yet seen as a sphere in which women, in a way, are becoming themselves participants of the exploited class. And in fact, some of the slogan is women joining the working class, right? Now, this in a way changes significantly, with the new, in the 1970s, when you have a new, what they call the second wave feminism, right? Which is, there's a whole discussion as to why, why in the 1970s, early 1970s, you have a new surge, of feminist activity. And, some theories connected to the fact that you have a capitalist class that now needs to expand. Juliet Mitchell, for example, in the third estate, has the position, claiming that, well, capitalism needed to expand the rank of the workers and therefore needed to integrate more women, into the workforce. But I think the prevalent position is that the 1970s are years of subversion, and mostly sparked off by the anti-colonial struggle and the struggle against racism in the South of the United States and against apartheid. And, in a sense, it's a period that the 70s is really a time in which the bottom rises. And you have, in a way, struggle in every sphere, the students, feminists, anti-war, but the fundamental, the motor of those movements is really the anti-colonial struggle. And I have to say that the fact that the women's movement in many of the feminists, in particular in the United States, who mobilized, who were the protagonists of the first feminist collectives, were women who had been involved in the student movement, but mostly in the anti-war movement, in the movement against the Vietnam War, or had gone down to the South, with the freedom rides. And in that process, they had seen some of the limits of the perspective, that their comrades, their leftist male comrades had taken, where they would see the misery of the Vietnamese, but they would not want to, famously, very famously, this has been repeated thousands of times, women were told that, well, after the revolution, right? But I think something I want to stress here, that something that I think has become very important for me, looking back and trying to have some synthesis of what happened, what is the story of these movements, conflicting as they've been, right? That because the feminist movement of the 70s, developed in the wake and also, sparked off by the anti-colonial struggle and the struggle of people fighting against Jim Crow, against slavery, the struggle of the wageless. It's a major turning point. It's a major turning point because it brings on the political scene openly, in a massive way, a political subject, the unwaged worker, a political subject that in a way had been marginalized in the more classical literature of the left, where the wage working class was always the center of the stage, right? Because they'll be the ones who were more capable of appropriating, and this I think is the perspective. I hope that you tell me if you disagree. They were more capable of appropriating, the technology provided by capitalism, and once in possession of that technology, they would be able to use it in a future socialist society to liberate people from the subjugation to work, right? And therefore liberate human time for higher pursuits, right? There are famous passages in Marx and Engels, the German ideology, the Grundrisse. There's a famous page, for example, that people have quoted and quoted in the Grundrisse, where Marx looks at the society, right, where in a sense the machine will do the work, right? That's a big discussion in itself, that maybe we'll go back to it. In fact, I think it's very central to, because it's very central to what kind of vision we have of the future, But instead, so from that perspective, you know, the socialist Marxist movement had always placed the wage worker as the ones who, in a sense, in Italian Marxist Mario Tronti, in Workers and Capital, has put it very clearly. Revolution is at the highest stages of capitalist development. Over and over and over, he repeated us in the 60s, revolution is at the highest stages. Those with the highest capitalist know-how, technological know-how, are those who will make the revolution. And I think that the 70s, you know, changed, as Robin Kelly put it, the 70s decentered, the struggle of the wages, anti-colonial, anti-racist, decentered, you know, the political subject of revolutionary activity, and put instead the slave, the one risking to be lynched, the colonial subject, and so on at the center, right? And I think that this importance of the wage, the beginning of a recognition, the beginning of a mass recognition, right? The work does not begin with the wage. In other words, work in the capitalist sense, work productive or capitalist accumulation does not begin or is not coextensive with the wage, no? But in fact, and possibly, the history of capitalist accumulation from its inception may have been even more dependent on the work of the slaves rather than on the work of the industrial workers, right? That affected in a conscious and unconscious way also the feminist movement. So there's a feminism that now begins to look at you know, something very important, I think, you know, enter into the feminist perspective in the 1970s. Three things: body, sexuality, housework, right? In other words, it's a whole sphere of activity which had always been, in a sense, left behind, ignored, or underestimated as an arena of political struggle, right, from the traditional movement of the left. And now, instead, is seen as a highly political area. No, the abortion movement, the movement for abortion, shows that actually women's body have been structured, have been commanded, have been appropriated by the state. In other words, nothing biological there, lots of political, right? Similar sexuality, you know, the whole structure of sexual norms, sexual, you know, punishments for sexual, you know, misbehavior. So in fact, the slogan, the personal is political, that slogan can also be taken in direction where we don't want to go, right? But I think that the slogan, you know, in a sense, capture, you know, the new elements in the feminist movement of the 70s, the politicization of the private, the breakdown of the traditional separation between private and public, and see that in fact the public is in the private. You know, a famous song of a woman from Canada, the state is in our bedroom. The state is in our bedroom. You know, what happens in our bedroom has nothing to do with biology, or what happens when we procreate is not ever purely biological. It's been completely structured by political relation. I think this was a very important understanding, although it never really issued into a politics. You know, I was part in the 1970s of a movement called the Wages for Household movement, which was incredibly maligned from everybody, feminists, Marxists, everybody has criticized the movement. But we, on the basis of the analysis that we did at the time, you know, of women's work in the home, domestic work, housework, we came to very different conclusions that many in the traditional left had. You know, we began to see that the home, the family are actually places of production. family sexual relation of production, because we began to realize that what women would do, in the home, seen on a mass level, working class women naturally, would be, the work of reproducing the workforce. So in a way that this work considered biological, in reality, is the pillar of every other work activity, because it's the area, the family, it's the factory where you produce the worker, you produce the capacity to work. The capacity to work is not a natural given. It's something that is consumed in the work process and has to be produced. Marx looks at that issue, but his answer is that the production of the workforce, Marx understands it very, very well. The capacity to work has to be produced, but he sees that production as being accomplished purely through the market, right? So, I think in any case that the work that we did and the kind of analysis that were done of sexuality, and by the way, it is not an accident that by 1975, you have the takeoff of a sex workers movement, with the occupation by prostitutes in the French town of Lyon of a church, to protest against the continuous killing of prostitutes. With that begins a huge sex workers movement, also a lesbian women's movement. In other words, this whole politicization, of so-called personal relation, of so-called private, the breakdown of the private, I think, and the analysis of the forms of exploitation that are taking place in the community, that are taking place in the home, umbilically linking the home to the factory. In other words, that exploitation, you don't have to go to the factory to be actually exploited by capital. I think that was extremely important. Organizationally, however, we were very much isolated. And then one of the reasons why, and I think here we are getting closer to the discussion of the present, very important turning point is the 1975 intervention of the United Nations into feminist politics. The 1975 intervention with the first of the global conferences on women, which took place in Mexico City, which took place with such famous feminists like the sister of the Shah of Iran, like Reagan's daughter, who was very conservative. It was taking place in an extremely conservative environment. Talks about Palestine were forbidden. There were actually big confrontation at the conference because the issue of Palestine could not be talked about. So in 1975, really begins, a whole massive intervention by the UN. And here I want to make a parallel that I think is very important. There is a very clear-cut relation between what begins to happen in 75 on the side of the United Nations with women, parallel with what happened, decades earlier with the process of decolonization. In other words, when it becomes clear that the anti-colonial struggle cannot be contained, cannot be channeled to very, pro-capitalist channel, then you begin to have a process in which the United Nations decide to lead the decolonization process. They appoint themselves as the leader of decolonization. And from now on, decolonization really is presented as a result of institutional intervention. Of course, previous to the killing, torture, murder of Lumumba, right? And the appointment of specific leaders who will maintain the relation of dependence of the particular country, from the colonial powers. So something very similar takes place in 1975 with the feminist movement. I think there was an understanding very early that the feminist movement had the potential, had a very subversive potential, because it was beginning to deal with issues that went directly to the question of reproduction. And let's not forget, for instance, and here you have to forget that many of my references are from the United States. But at that time, in the United States, simultaneously with the feminist movement, you had a surge of a welfare mothers movement, a movement made primarily of Black women, not because Black women were numerically the main recipient. That was not true. Although all the medias, converged on presenting it. So to create the image of the Black woman with parasite on the wage worker, right, on the white wage worker. But because Black women had a whole infrastructure of struggle, they had a whole history of struggle. They were coming from the civil rights movement. They were, involved in Black power. So there was a combativeness, a powerful combativeness that basically led them to say, and here again, there's an element of feminism, led them to say, raising children is work, and is work for you, is work for your society. When you want soldiers, you take our children. When you want people for your factory to exploit, you take our children. When we ask for some support, you say it's our business, right? They were saying things like, okay, if you only say work, when the children are not yours, we'll swap them, So there was a powerful welfare movement. I think this is the reason why we begin to have an intervention of the US at this stage. And mind you, these are really important. I think I'm trying to build a canvas. I'm trying to build a scenario, because I really think important to see what are the forces, because those forces in one way or the other are still with us. What is happening in 75? 75 is a crucial. And I don't know, many of you maybe are younger, but if you are my age, you remember that 75 is a crucial year. It's a turning point here, right? Because it's the beginning of the counter-revolution. It's the beginning of a set of maneuvering, by the international institution like IMF, American government, then IMF, World Bank, right? Maneuvering to restructure the world economy in a way that can disempower, that can put an end to the powerful surge of movements, like the ones I mentioned, the 60s, anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-apartheid, anti-war, that in a way had really subverted some of the main instruments, of control of the capitalist system historically, right? So that's basically the United Nations intervention in feminist politics occurs strategically at the moment of the restructuring of the world economy, at the moment in which the highest level of a capitalist institution, see the need to turn the world upside down, to restructure the world economy. For example, deindustrialize, partially at least, the United States, move industry into the so-called third world, right? Restructure economy of Europe, US, primarily around service sector, necessarily bring in a lot of willing women, because here too, the bourgeois feminist movement in the 70s, like organization like now, the National Organization of Women in the US, were fighting for entrance into the labor force, equal rights, equality with men, etc., etc. So use that impetus to basically create a new workforce, which we have seen over the years, totally underpaid, totally precarious, most of the time doing the same work that they would do in the home, except in an institutional setting. I've been a week in a hospital now, day and night, and I can tell you, the most of the workers below the doctor is mostly women who are working, earning a pittance. And many of them are women coming from abroad. So the United Nations comes in a way to help the capitalist class to readjust, right, all the normative level in such a way as to allow for a massive restructuring of the global workforce, for the new international division of labor, and also a new organization of the process of reproduction. And one of the immediate consequences, was massive entrance of women, Europe, US, and other countries into the wage workforce, as I said, at the lowest level, most underpaid, often most hazardous, right? Transference of industry in Asia, Mexico, in the so-called free export zone, where labor is completely deregulated, and where the workforce will be young women, working at slave rate, sometimes, 20 hours a day, 14 hours a day, way into the night, right? Now, what has to be added is that with this restructuring of the global economy, as you all know very well, right? The first step that takes place is a process of recolonization of the former colonies, through the debt crisis, through financial means that totally engineered that crisis. And upon that, the introduction of the structural adjustment program, and then all the conditionalities posed by the IMF and the World Bank on the structurally adjusted country. So that's what we have. We have a restructuring of the world economy. I know that I'm not saying anything new, but I want to make some point on that. I know that this is well known, is because what we have seen over and over and over. To this day, Argentina is still being restructured by the IMF, right? In other words, it's very interesting, I think, first of all, to see that the restructuring of the world economy that begins in 1975 and continues to this day, right, begins with the process of recolonization of the former colonies, begins with a process now, at first, by purely financial means, the debt crisis, which was engineered in 1979 when the US Federal Reserve decides to increase the price of the dollars so that all the debt, the loans that the former colonies, the newly developing, third world countries, coming out of colonialism, all the loans they had taken to develop, to catch up development, right, becomes unpayable. The same country, as you know, are not allowed to go to the monetary markets. They are forced to go to the IMF. The IMF imposes these conditionalities. And these conditionalities are the conditionalities that they are destroying the country, destroying local industry, forcing people to import, forcing them to import, et cetera, et cetera. and imposing massive process of privatization, imposing in the name of countries having to pay their debt, imposing that the same country open up their door to every extractivist company in the world, mining, agribusiness, oil, etc. Even, companies producing green gasoline. Okay, so we know this, right? This is the moment in which the United Nations enter the feminist field and dominates it for a number of years, with 4 conferences, 4 major global conferences on women, out of which comes out the new feminism, and out of which come out really a major attack, on the feminist movement, which by and large is domesticated, which by and large becomes institutionalized, never completely. It's important to stress it. And it's really terrible that many people believe that was the end of feminism. It was not, but certainly it was major, appropriation of an incredible amount of energy, people, and so on, spaces, and again, presenting itself as the liberator, And of course, what is women's liberation? Women's liberation is the right to make it in Wall Street. It's okay to make pies, but you have to sell them. Be an equal participant in the market, right? It's equal rights with men. But which men? Which equal rights? With the black men in the American ghettos, right, risking to be killed by the police every day, or the white men up there in Wall Street, right? So equality with men, the ERA, but it becomes a big, right? Financial independence, right? So the question of opening up, any kind of male-dominated area. And violence, but violence by men against women, never the violence of the state, never the violence of war, never institutional violence, which in fact, as we analyzed it, is always the condition for individual violence. Because individual violence in most cases takes place because there's a presumption of impunity, right? So, never, the United Nations made a criticism of the savage attack to the reproductive system of the former colonial world, right? To the level of impoverishment in which people were plunged by the International Monetary Fund upon the giving of loans, when the Monetary Fund would impose massive devaluation, so the local currencies are nothing. When they would impose shutting down of local, economic activities, industries, enforcing the liberalization of imports, whereby a lot of people have no possibility to buy anything, where they would impose, right, taking over by the state of large tracts of land to be given to oil companies and so forth, beginning the diaspora that is now continuing in the immigration process. People are leaving, but of course it's so cruel and sadistic that the very countries that have forced them to leave are now penalizing them when they decide to migrate, right? So then change of law. There's a major change in the legislation of the former third world that takes place. For instance, the attack to communal law. Most, for example, West Africa. I lived in West Africa in the 80s, and I was very surprised to find that a lot of the land was on community still. In fact, the village, everybody felt safe, even if they had a poor job, because the idea was, worst come to worst, you go to the village. And then the village doesn't allow you to die. The village is a post system. No, you have to privatize the land, and communal law is undermined. The commons, the communal land, have to be privatized and divided up individual titling. So there is a massive, massive, and of course, with all these measures came also, a feminist movement that supported them. For example, in large parts of Africa, in the 1980s, we saw the rise of a feminism that supported the privatization of land, middle class or upper class feminism that supported the privatization of land, because that would allow women traditionally excluded from land property to own land, right? Or a feminism that was struggling for women to also be given an individual title. When the common land is divided up in different pieces, this has always been a very violent process, very, very violent. Imagine, people don't have pieces of paper saying who owns what. Lots of people. So here, the division and the selling of individual plots is a very violent, But, so the struggle is not massive land reclamation, as we saw later in Latin America. So I'm building a scenario to show that actually by the mid-70s and then through the 1980s and 90s, right, hand in hand with the destruction of the world economy, the recolonization of the third world, and in the wake of this recolonization, right, the neoliberalization also of every economy of the world, right? Because by the 1990s, all the state government, state budget, cuts to social services, cuts to any welfare reform. The United States abolishes welfare reforms, cuts to support to universities, to schooling, to healthcare. Hospitals are closed. And here I speak about the US. We have been neoliberalized, before COVID, in the 20 years before COVID, 49 hospitals were closed because they were not productive enough. So the notion of productivity, a hospital has to be money-making. So there's a whole also culture, as you know, neoliberalism has completely changed the cultural figures. Yeah, presumably, financial health is the criteria, which means it is, profitable, is the criteria for the continuation of an activity or a service. So out of this now we see, I think that particularly since the 90s, we see even more of a bifurcation between a liberal, bourgeois, feminist movement, moving step by step, with the prescription, of the United Nations, seeing women's liberation as the ability to be equal partner with men and basically fully integrated. And at the core of it, the entrance of women in the military, the entrance of women, we fought against it. We fought against it very much. But the entrance of women in the military was seen as really a measure of how much women have finally reached, equality with men. And our slogan at the time was not men out of the military. Men have to be equal to women. If we talk about equality, let's men be equal to us and no more military, right? At the same time, so we have seen basically the development also in another kind of feminism, very, very important. We have seen the development of another kind of feminism that in the US and internationally. And I want to talk now about this other kind of feminism, and then look at what some of the prospects there, what are the possibilities that are in front of us now. And I really also want to see, in the United States, certainly there has been really, since the late 1970s, there's been very much a divergence between a feminist movement that in many ways, by and large, was becoming more and more institutionalized, more accepted institutionally in every sphere, including schooling. For example, the rise of women's studies, very important. I have to say that feminists have given really created a very powerful critique of science, the idea that science has to be neutral, a critique of cultural form, have done a lot of historical work, reconstructing women's history, etc. But at the same time, women's studies has become increasingly more and more, separated from social action. And it has increasingly lost a lot of the subversive power that it had in the earliest year, when it was really bringing into the schools, into the university, into the places for the production of knowledge, really the demands of the struggle. And instead, you have a kind of women's studies that is now divorced from women's action. So at the same time, you have a movement, first of all, of Black women that begins to rise, the reproductive justice movement, very, very important. The reproductive justice movement is a movement that rises, first of all, to protect the rights of Black women who would find themselves to be treated as second-class citizens, every time they will go to a healthcare structure, but also to criticize, to separate from the formulation, increasing formulation, of the more institutionalized women's movement with respect to abortion, contraception, control of our body. So by the end of the 70s, you have a movement that begins to say, my body, my property, and abortion is choice. Abortion is choice. And it's specifically against this idea of abortion being choice that the reproductive justice movement, which was primarily a Black women's movement, arose. Because, quite rightly, they pointed out that abortion is the negative side of choice, is the possibility to refuse a forced maternity. But a choice is the possibility to decide whether you want to have or don't want to have children, and how crucial this possibility is in a historical context where Black women have always been denied maternity. From slavery, when they saw their children being put at the auction, to later, when they'll be subjected to all kinds of forms of sterilization, continuing into the present, and particularly strong in the case of women who would be, beneficiary of welfare, of welfare monies. So many times, women who would go to the hospital and would wake up from the anesthesia, and they will be presented a piece of paper, and they'll be told, sign here that you'll be sterilized, that you'll have your tube tied. If not, you will be cut off from your welfare check, and then you'll be on the street. And so the reproductive justice movement is a movement that basically came to really present a very other view that to me is extremely important. We cannot fight for abortion without at the same fight for the right to maternity. This, and I don't know if in Poland, I know there's been a very, very powerful, pro-abortion movement in Poland. I don't know if the women have taken that perspective, and the need continues, because I don't know if you realize that in the United States recently, the right to abortion has been revoked. But more than that, or together with that, we have seen the passing of laws that are intended to protect the fetus protective legislation. This is a terrible, it's done in the name of protecting life, but actually is meant, I think, to discourage a lot of poor Black women from having children. Because the moment you are in a state with those laws and you become pregnant, you are liable, It sets up a hostility between the fetus and the mother. It means that anything you do, even if you take medicines that you need for your health, but have an impact on the fetus, you can be criminalized, even on that level, not only drugs. In other words, you can be accused of manslaughter by your behavior. So it becomes a very dangerous, and in the United States, this grand land of democracy, already in a number of states, there are control networks set up, maybe in your country too, wherever you are, that connect the hospital, the nurses, the doctors to the police. So that, for example, when a pregnant woman goes to a hospital or to a healthcare center to have a blood test, she has to be very careful, because if the blood test shows any abnormality, she could have the police on her doorstep the next day. This is not speculation. This has already happened. A number of women have been fighting cases about this issue. So the question of how do we fight? How do we fight about the question of reproduction, procreation, right? Abortion is not enough. The question of maternity. And also, a movement has begun, very important. And here too is one of the splits between the bourgeois and the more radical revolutionary women's movement on this question, the issue of the new reproductive technologies, right? These reproductive technologies are being marketed, in vitro fertilization, prenatal diagnosis, right? They are being, presented, amniocentesis, they're all being presented as liberating, with the assumption that what is enslaving women is their own nature, is their own body. That is the body, the maternity is actually a negative, oppressive, activity. So status. So the idea is, and here's the neoliberal woman whose goal and sense of value presumably comes from making it in Wall Street or in some high-level occupation. Presumably, the idea is that you don't want to interrupt your career, and you'd have, freeze your eggs for a later time when you may have the time to have children, or have, the eggs implanted, the sperm of the husband implanted in the body of another woman through surrogate motherhood. So this is another big split that has developed between women, Black women in particular. There's been a lot of criticism, of course. Angela Davis has written about it, many Black women. Dorothy Roberts in Killing the Black Body have written about it, that these are very classical, colonial, they are promoted as liberating women, but they are actually reinstitution of very colonial forms, of relation, the whole issue of surrogacy. So a new movement, the movement of reproductive rights. We've also seen the developing, still mostly Black women, but not exclusively, that has become abolitionist. Abolitionist of prisons, abolitionist of the police. And in this sense, there's been a whole issue in the feminist movement. How do we deal with the question of violence? How do we define what is violence? Is violence only when a person uses a knife? Or is, for example, structural adjustment, the conditionalities that are imposed, on countries and individuals to be able to have some credit, to be able to have access to money? Isn't that violence when they impoverish you? Is only certain ways of dying that should be classified as violence? Isn't there violence by fiscal means? So I think that here is another very important divide. The question of, a movement has begun about abolition, that is abolition of all these oppressive means. And that means, again, a critical perspective, on, for example, the demand by certain section of the feminist movement that a response to male violence against women being the increase of penalties. Because history has proven that that increase of penalties actually goes to criminalize, and those who are already decriminalized is always used usually against the poorest, against Black people, against those who are already facing a whole set of discrimination. Moreover, at the same time, we have seen a whole new movement in Europe, in the US, a growth of domestic workers movement, right? Very, very powerful, who are now, in a way, carrying on and giving organizational legs to some of the issues that we discussed at the beginning of the feminist movement in the 70s. One of the responses to the immense impoverishment of large areas of the world, Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, Asia, the Philippines, due to these monstrous, really monstrous, structural adjustment, privatization programs, has been migration. And there is a particular type of female migration. Women coming, going to the places where their money is going. They're actually following the trail of the money, They are not to become domestic workers or to become sex workers. Many women go abroad to become domestic workers, and then the conditions are so poor. They are so bad. The earning they make are so poor that they prefer to become sex work, and that's another big issue. So the domestic workers movement now, an international force, and I think is a really internationally very, very powerful movement. Of course, I don't want to generalize, but certainly they have placed on the table of feminism all the issues that we were discussing, in the early 70s. Slogan like, without us, nothing moves. Without us, nothing moves. You take away the work of reproduction of human beings on a day-to-day basis, and the world stops, right? Without reproductive work, everything stops. And they are beginning to make coalition. They are the beginning of an international coalition. I just came back from Europe. I was in Belgium, and I was in Brussels, and I went to one of these meetings between women in Belgium, domestic workers in Belgium, mostly from Africa or from the Caribbean, and then domestic workers from Spain, they too, mostly from the Caribbean, some from Asia. It was a very powerful meeting, and an example of what I'm referring to, of some of these new movements that are now on the scene. And they were talking about, sharing organizational know-hows, what to do, and beginning to build coalition. And so in Spain, this domestic workers movement that is led by this organization called Territorio Domestico, they are, been able to win the fact that they are now, considered, they have been able to force the Spanish state to adopt the law 186 recommended by the ILO, International Labour Organization, which gives domestic workers, all domestic workers, the same rights as every other worker. Some pension, health care, a limited amount of hours every day, etc., etc. So this is one of the upshots, right, that has come. And I have to say that what I call the bourgeois women's movement has come out of the United Nations global conferences as neither mobilized in support of welfare mothers, nor as mobilized in support of domestic workers. Though that struggle requires a lot of feminist support, because domestic workers movement is also facing the whole issue of immigration. Is also facing, but the movement is a very interesting one because it's bringing together the issue of racism, the issue of coloniality, the issue of domestic work, the power, importance of domestic work, of reproductive work. So it's a movement that brings back themes of the early feminist movement of the 70s, but on a broader, more internationalist platform. And I think it's extremely, and because most of the women are Black, most of the women come from all the different parts of the world, it has a great knowledge and a great power. But also what we have seen taking place, maybe I should stop here for a minute. Actually, I wanted a conversation and then I went on and on and on and on. Maybe let me stop here at least for a few minutes and then I'll continue with the last two main points that I want to make. Maybe if there's any question or any objection or any points of clarification, maybe this is a moment to have a 5 minutes then. Yeah,
thank you. Thank you so much. We've had a very lively discussion also in the chat with interesting perspectives from Rafaela in Brazil, Maria in Poland, and others. And if you would like to share those with the group, and if not in writing, then you're very welcome to do so. But now I see we have someone with their hand up. So two people with their hands up. So please, why don't you speak in turn? And good.
Yes.
A little bit of an exchange.
Yes.
I think. Please forgive me if I mispronounce your name. Is it Jigdem? Jigdem. You had your hand up first, and then it was David, and then Adrian.
Okay.
Good evening, Silvia and all. It is Çiğdem, actually. I'm from Turkey. I'm from the Turkish feminist movement in Turkey, not the Turkish. But actually, I would like to, ask something about the rise of the extreme right-wing governments, which is the Turkish government is actually one of them. And what we experienced in Turkey was actually the kind of, pro-government and pro-market feminism had been supported during the 90s. But since the beginning of the 2000s, the rise of the Islamist, fascistic, and market-oriented neoliberal government pushed all of the mainstreaming feminism that none of the lobbyists of feminism now have any grounds. And actually we have problems. I mean, the government is pushing for every woman should have at least 3 children. They are organizing pro-family campaigns and anti-gender campaigns with the religious sects and organizations. And actually the right to the surname of, I'm using your own surname, has been engendered. Yeah, we had yesterday a demonstration again about that. So, I mean, actually, of course, there was a kind of, a kind of lean feminism, neoliberalistic World Bank feminism. But do you still think that it has ground on the third world countries, or actually countries like Turkey, which have experienced the rise of the Islamic or, I mean, religioustic, fascistic right-wing governments, which actually try to destroy all the autonomy of women now? I mean, they seem as if they left all that, contribution, governance things. And do you still think this is a real subject, or because they even in Turkey canceled the Istanbul Convention, which they had to, So my problem is, I mean, can you, a bit connect the development of some kind of radical feminist movements like in Argentina, Brazil, Latin America, Nino Menos, and this kind of political environment?
Well, I don't know, what the other questions are. I'm going to respond briefly now, and then more when I hear also the other question, because they may be connected, right? This is a very important issue. It's a very, very important, because in a less dramatic way, we in the United States are facing a similar situation. So Biden is all pro-feminist. Biden is all pro-feminist, pro-trans, everything, pro-abortion. And then we have Trump. Trump is the fascist, the super fascist. I don't think that, your Turkish government can be even more fascist than what Trump aspires to be, what he aspires to be. He's surrounded by people who are, But here's the problem that I see. We need a third force. Because look at Biden feminism. The Biden feminism, which is the neoliberal feminism, is very happy with the extermination of women in Palestine. Is very happy with the extermination of women. And the great feminist, neoliberal feminist, Hillary Clinton, she supervised the coup in Honduras. She, with Obama, supervised the coup in Libya. And where were they when entire towns in Iraq were razed to the ground, when the entire, reproductive infrastructure? So we have, a neoliberal feminism, institutional, with all the laws, against violence against women, and again, that in reality applies only to a limited category of women across the world, but actually is quite happy with the most atrocious policies, towards entire population, women included, like what we see in Palestine, in the Sudan, in the Congo, what is happening with NATO in Africa now, for instance, in the Sahel, so, and it's not new, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. So this promoting, and it's such a joke that, the United States speaks of the Afghanistan women's right when they have practically destroyed the country. So I think that this question is very important. But to me, what I like to speak to and see happening is not a bouncing back and forth between a kind of democratic fascism, which basically, selects, is less universally confrontational, and in fact selects areas of freedom, selects areas of privilege, but then is quite happy with massive destruction, on the colonial style, and instead, and instead a very open, fascist regime. And it seems to me, I'm looking at women's movement to see the possibility of a rising of a third force. Why we cannot have, what does it mean? What are the steps to be taken to create a third ground so that we are not bouncing between one or the other? And this goes along with I've been going around, this is the question I think everybody has. How do we get here? How do you get to the point where, for example, working class people in Argentina are voting this horrible, monstrous person with Spilai? Why in Italy you have somebody who goes to power like Meloni? And the answer often has been really the fault, the limits, the absence of the social democratic governments who actually created such disaster condition for people. This is not the only cause, but one important element has also been the limit. And the issue again and again, why don't we have a third force? How do we build a third force? Yeah, there are two other questions.
Thank you. And in fact, we have 5 other questions.
Okay.
And you're in a very neat row at the top. I hope you're in the same order as you are for me. And if you are, can I just invite each of you to save time to just ask your question when the previous one's been answered? Feel free to go next and lower your hand once you've asked your question. Thank you.
I think you said earlier it's me up next, so if that's correct, I'll go quickly. Thank you so much for your talk, Professor. My question is about the concept of family abolitionism as another form of abolitionism alongside prison and police abolitionism that you briefly mentioned. I just want to hear your thoughts about it and how you think that sort of struggles for, let's say, the communization of care beyond the nuclear family tie in with other anti-capitalist struggles today. Thank you.
Yeah. So, as somebody put it, and I think is a very good, for me, it has struck me. The family is like the union, right? They protect you, and at the same time, in the form that they have today, the Clase, the nuclear family, and at the same time, they tie you, they actually reproduce you as a worker, because the organization of the nuclear family is really part of the engine, right, of the reproduction of a workforce, right? So, like the union, you have to be very careful when you fight against it, right? So in a sense, you have to change it. You have to open up the family and really work towards extended families. We have to work out, again, towards communitarian relation. And in fact, one of the things I was going to say in the next segment of my presentation is that, one of the consequences, one of the responses, non-neoliberal, on the contrary, radical responses that have come, in the aftermath of this massive expansion of capitalist relation, across the former colonial world, as well as in the so-called developed countries, this massive privatization and massive war on reproduction, war on the resources that people need for reproduction, right? You take away land, you cut the forest, right? You basically cut social services, etc. Has been a proliferation you know, of movement, communitarian movement that are, you know, commoning, you know, I write about it, many people have written about it, the process of the day-to-day reproduction of life, you know, and is a process that has many, many battlefields, land reclamation, you know, fighting against deforestation, fighting against the contamination of rivers, and at the same time, also beginning to create more communal way, you know, of reproducing life, right? So the family, as I said, you know, has to be expanded, which is not to say no to strong individual relation, but the family now is a labor contract. It's a labor organization, you know, it's not, you know, so for example, is a preparation of the future children to become part of the workforce, as well as reproduction of the elderly, and the adults as workers. So you're right, you know. So we have to be careful when we talk about abolition of the family, be sure that we know what we replace with it. Because I think in the 70s, often in the commune, abolish the family, smash monogamy. It's very important to understand what is there, creating the alternative, so that does not become, you know, one more distraction. But you're right, as you know, as the previous speaker spoke, the right wing has huge investment, you know, in the patriarchal family, in this very individual, privatized, individualizing, patriarchal, you know, family life. And that, of course, is something that we have to change. Third person.
Hello. Many thanks for the talk. Very, very, very interesting. I'll try to act as a little bit of the devil's advocate.
Okay.
Because I've heard quite a few opinions of my friends who believe that the feminist movement is odd for a rebranding. And as I hear you talk about the feminist movement over the history, I kind of see two reasons for why that might be so, and I really wanted to hear your opinions about it. The first reason, because you mentioned there's this huge fragmentation of feminist movements within themselves. So you mentioned the neoliberal feminist movements and the classical feminist movements. And the second point being that the feminist movements and like the radical feminist movements has started to encompass so many other issues beyond just feminism. Like you mentioned, the class, the economic struggle. It's kind of, to me, it kind of becomes like a humanist movement. And I was just very interested to hear your opinions about this. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, I'm thinking in particular, I mean, you know, that, you know, in response, so what I was trying to describe, you know, as a result of the restructuring of the world economy, and that really gets me closer to some of the points I want to make also about Palestine, you know, what is happening now and where we're going, that one of the consequences of this massive expansion of capitalist relation to new territories, recolonizing the third world, right? Recolonizing means privatizing land, expelling people, right? It means all kinds of mineral devastation of the territory, you know, monoculture, the soya. This is what is happening today. I mean, in every part of the world, communities are completely being devastated. Deforestation, right? So there is now a tremendous struggle. I think that the struggle over the land meaning much more than just the soil, It's huge all over the world. And I think there's a feminist movement that has been very, very powerful emerging out of that, both in urban area and in rural area. Merging, with, like in Latin America, they call it popular feminism. Popular feminism is a movement that is not separate from massive social movement, labor, ecology, indigenous movements, right? But works with them and takes from them, right? So that for me, for instance, there's been also a feminization, a feminization of broad social movement throughout Latin America, Asia. For instance, now you have Sarawak women in Malaysia, fighting against deforestation and seeing themselves as feminists, protecting the earth, protecting, the soil from the cultivation of palm oil or from the cultivation of soya. You have Guarani women who see themselves as feminists, fighting in Argentina, in Ecuador, in Brazil, in Mato Grosso. Recently, one of them was burned, accused of being a witch, because she was leading a struggle of women, against a company that wanted to privatize, was in complicity with the government to privatize land, to organize, the cultivation of soya, right? So the question of pollution of rivers, these are struggles that are dealing with large number of people, but also, and more have been led by women. And this is the kind of feminism that I'm talking about. And it's not that it's ceasing to be a feminist movement, because the issue of reproduction, think of a woman, for example, women come from a whole experience of raising children, taking care of family, dealing with issue of health, dealing with issue of, education with children, food, food production, cooking. Imagine when the water that you take has petroleum in it. Imagine when it's contaminated and you have to cook for the family, right? The destruction of a forest is the destruction of a whole system of reproduction. A forest has everything in it: fruits, tubers, medical leaves, medical herbs. So it's not an accident that you have a movement of women led by women on the moment in which some of the most basic resources necessary for the reproduction of our life are actually at stake, are actually, being destroyed. And so today we see, for example, in Argentina, and there is an also different conception of what fighting against violence against women, right? Because now when you fight against violence against women, you don't fight just against an individual man. You're fighting against the police, against the paramilitaries, who are protecting the companies, who are protecting transnational companies. You're fighting against soldiers, security guard. There are security guards everywhere. Because also, and this is really, I'm continuing my discourse, with the devastation, with the recolonization of large part of the world, has come a militarization of everyday life, which we see everywhere. So this has also become another major issue. We see now women who are fighting against the militarization of life, and also many women have been killed. The Berta Cáceres, the Mariella Franco, these are the names that are most known. But in fact, there is a whole new forms of violence against women, which comes not from the husband, not from the lover who has been abandoned, but comes from the fact that now women are leading struggles that have to do with defending the most basic resources for our reproduction. You know, in Guatemala, in Latin America, you know, you have indigenous feminists. There's a movement of indigenous feminists who call themselves communitarian feminists. And they have forged the concept of the body territory. You know, the body territory means our bodies cannot live without the land, cannot live without the territory, right? And the defense of our bodies is necessary for the defense of the land. We can have movement while defending the land unless we also defend the women who are fighting for it. You know, so, and also they are stressing how important the question of land, not losing the land, it is, right? And this is very important. In fact, I would say that the struggle over the land meaning waters, air, forest, you know, food, rivers, sea, coastlines, and some of the most important, you know, struggle on earth today. Some of the most important struggles on earth. The moment we have all this, all the lands of the world, in the end of capitalist corporation, we have no control of our life. Last year, the United Nations celebrated, you know, the fact that for the first time in the history of humanity, most of the population of the world lived in cities. They saw it as very progressive. This is a sign of progress. I was terrified. I said, oh my God, this is terrible. Because that means that in their view, progress is everybody's in the cities and the lands of the world, the seas, the forests, the animals, are in the end of capitalist corporation. When that happens, the ability, our ability to shape our life, to control our life, is going to be terribly, terribly undermined. Whatever limits we have today is going to be even further destroyed. So I think the movement that I refer to, it very inspires me. That when I look at part of Asia, Latin America, Africa, I see that now, in front of this war against the reproduction of life, we see this women's movement very deeply rooted in mass struggles that are in fact taking up the issue of the forest. Because the forest is part of the reproduction of life. Without the forest, we do not breathe. Without the clean water, we die. Imagine our mothers or your mother, my mother, if they had to cook with water that had oil in it, they had petroleum in it, as is now happening in so many places. Not only means you have to walk miles and miles and miles to go get some clean water, but it means that what happens? How do you go? You know, this is what I'm talking about.
If I can just very quickly make a brief intervention.
Yes,
we have
yes.
24 minutes left.
All
and
right,
we have to be
okay.
strict to
So
the schedule because we have
Yeah.
two heroic interpreters, Yvonne and Mariana, who just already doing a very difficult job, and we can't push it past the
Okay,
the
no,
mark.
no, we don't, okay.
Just
All
a
right.
short note. So I'm going to pass it now to Ruth and then
Okay. And then
Lisa.
we continue, yes, yeah.
So thank you very much. I know many things you said, but I appreciate very much you put them together. And the ecofeminist point is also very important. And but the Palestine issue has just lost us, and we are into the struggle. And I feel a need. We need to have, beside the depth for climate struggle that you are into, also we need some lever on the economical field to demand that we can demand everywhere in the world together. And so that what we have now in the struggle for human rights in Palestine is that there's a division in the authoritarian, religious, patriarchal forces in fighting. They keep each other in power. And this feminist framing is never seen in the discourse anymore. And this is what I'm missing very much. We had feminist anti-war discourses in the 90s. And how can we come back to this and empower United Nations Assembly United for Peace vote with a resolution 1325, so that the women may wage peace, but because a patriarchal, theocratic, autocrat male warmongers will never make peace. So that would be one maybe naive idea about what we can do about Palestine. I don't know if it is too naive, but I hope also that there will be found any economic lever that we can discuss about and come away from the authoritarian movements that we have also Southern universalists. We don't need to have Western universalism. We can have other universalisms, but some kind of feminist universalism would be good, and then some kind of to break the machine, because I feel the machine is so destructive.
Yeah.
Together about one demand that goes into the direction to the system change we need to just to have a regenerative economy, because the learning starts everywhere, because the forest is not forest. We have industrial forests here, people starting to wanting to learn how to regenerate their small rivers. All this, the learning starts, and we need to have some demand to unite about as feminists everywhere. Okay.
Yeah, this is. I think this is a very important question, and this is really my last contribution to this discussion, because I was going to say that when you look at the world that I described, the world that has been created through the structural adjustment program, to the privatization, to the neoliberalization, and which I have characterized as a war on the reproduction of life. And in fact, has also, at least for the last 20, 30 years, really developed a whole set of wars, in support of it, because people respond, people rebel. We have seen revolts upon revolts upon revolts against this. So, but we have seen the destruction of Iraq. We have seen a militarization of the world. So in front of this, my argument has been lately, Palestine is the world. Palestine is the world. Palestine is the most extreme, because we are witnessing the intended complete extermination of a population. But Palestine is the world, because what is happening in Palestine has been happening in many other places, in Iraq, in Libya, in Afghanistan, now in the Sudan, the Congo. And in each case, the common denominator, because after all, what has been happening in Palestine, Israel since 1948 has been given, the mandate by the British and by the Americans. Let's face it, Israel will not do anything without the United States. So we are really talking about the highest level of international capitalist power. What is happening now, the destruction of Palestine, is really decided at the highest level. Israel is the executor. Israel is the executor. They do the dirty work, but they are actually the executor. The 20,000 pounds of bombs that are coming, they're coming fabricated in the United States. So Palestine is the world. That means that the question of a systemic change, there's been many initiatives by feminists all over the world, to protest. We did one. We collected signature. We made statement, and we circulated. I know women in Italy. I just received many women in many countries have made statements, but that's not enough. I think that what we need to do is to actually think, how do we have today a systemic change? And we need to very clearly analyze what is the organization of the world, because it is clear that we have a capitalism who is willing to destroy entire population in order to resolve its own crisis and in order to maintain itself power over the world economy. And that means extracting the last drop of oil. That means, forcing, people to migrate and at the same time forcing them to work as slaves, cutting as much as possible. And it's very interesting. I think we need to analyze as feminists the new forms of war, because the new forms of war are really wars that are intended to destruct the reproductive infrastructure of the countries that are being attacked. What is happening in Palestine? Palestine is the world, the hospital, the schools, the collective memory. They're killing the children because the children are the future, and the women, and then the hospital, the intelligentsia, the school. But this kind of destruction of the reproductive infrastructure is what, for example, the US and NATO have pursued everywhere. If you look at Iraq, I've gone back to read what happened in Iraq, in Fallujah, and it was very clear. They intend to destroy anything they allow for the production of people. Build, I would say, outfit, they were purifying water, pharmacies, bridges, water system, electrical system, so that people continue to die even after the bombs have fallen. People continue to die. And the country is so destroyed that practically the core, it's very easy then to install puppets who make agreement with the company, with the transnational corporation. So the issue of a systemic change, and the systemic change have to see, first of all, how our everyday life, not only that we go in the street and we say free Palestine, which is essential, which is absolutely essential. Not only we work to make sure that all the workers that are involved in moving the bombs and are on strike, refuse to participate in these massacres, but also begin to analyze how the organization of our everyday life, not to promote individual solution, but to understand the kind of movement that we need. I don't know where you're from, but your accent reminded me of Germany. And I was thinking of the work of Maria Mies. I've been reading recently a lot of Maria Mies. Yes. And she understood, she saw it so powerfully. She understood that the way how everyday life is organized are connected with the destruction of the world. And to recognize that is not to guilt trip, it's nothing to do with guilt, but is to understand what kind of movement we have to, because we have an international division of labor, where the prosperity of the few is built on the misery of the many, where the food that we eat is costing blood, in Mexico, and she spoke very powerfully of the fact that this system, by distancing more and more the production from the consumption, makes us all responsible involuntarily into the immiseration of large part of the world. We are becoming responsible involuntarily because we are actually consuming avocados, which probably have been produced under slave-like labor conditions in Mexico or in Malaysia, etc., etc. So the fact of movements that are not only descending in the street to protest this atrocity or that atrocity, but have in fact a long-term process, a cosmovision, a cosmopolitics. The long term that the communists had, we can be all critical of them, but at least they had a vision of a society. Today, often that vision is missing. Today, often we have activism that are not for the long term, that are not for addressing systemic change. And this, to me, is what we need to learn. This, to me, is the power of my saying Palestine is the world. I often say we have Palestine in the street of New York. We have people are homeless. People are dying in the street. We can see them. We have been dehumanized so much that now we have become used to walk in the street, to see people begging, to see people treated like refuse. And we carry on. We carry on because we don't know what to do. But how can we live? How can we build a new society accepting that? So we need a new kind of movements. We really need a new kind of vision. We need a new kind of vision in which we bring together all these issues, the destruction of the earth, the destruction of the animal, the extermination of people, the mockery of every humanitarian. They speak of humanitarian, of human rights. What a mockery. What a mockery. They speak of democracy. What a mockery. So this is what we need. And this, in my view, when I look at all the movements, I often say, well, the feminist movement potentially, as I said, an anti-systemic feminist movement of the kind we now see in many parts of the third world, of the so-called third world, is the kind of movement connected, with mass struggles, connected with mass struggle that are not only for survival, but already understanding that you cannot survive without creating something new. You cannot survive by simply saying no. You have to survive by actually constructing something new. The struggle has to have a constructive element. Constructive, in terms of economically, politically, socially, culturally, And I think building this kind of movement, I see the feminism because, what is more basic than the question of the reproduction of life, right? In Latin America, they say, whatever we do, we put life at the center. Whatever we put, we want to valorize life. For a society that valorizes life, and where we are, in a sense, regaining not only the land, but regaining our decisional power. We are expropriated not only from the land and the resources, but from the possibility to decide about the most important things in our life.
Thank you. I have a very quick proposal. I'll be extremely quick. We have 4 questions, 10 minutes. I propose less than 1 minute per intervention if possible. Oh. We won't expect Professor Federici to answer all of them, but what I suggest we do is we take these thoughts and these questions back into the chat. Good. And we can do a discussion there, and I'll share some of what is said with Professor Federici afterwards. So please, Milica.
Thank you very much. Now I have a question. Probably Professor Silvia already answered some aspects of it, but still I would like to hear if there is something else more to add. If we tend and we want to center the policies more around the reproduction of life, by integrally including questions of work, gender, new forms of colonialism, environmental issues, new forms of war, how to do this in contemporary context and for the future? Which kind of heterodox approach or political economy we should rely on, and how, and whether it be good to start by crossing this theory with the bottom-up approaches and social movements findings in thinking about local, national, and international policy.
So I respond to one by one, or I respond to all of them at the end?
Can we try and take all of them, because we have 9 minutes left.
Okay. Yes.
Fatima.
Okay.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. So my question is, amidst the growing trend of social media, how do you see social media as a tool for organizing working class women? And also a little note, it's an honor for me to translate your book Patriarchy of the Wage into Indonesian language. So I just want to say that. Thank you so much.
Oh my God, I haven't seen it. Oh, I love to see it okay. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Evelyn.
Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. A quick question, I guess, moving from the theoretical into the practical, for those of us working in women's empowerment, care work, sexual and reproductive health and rights, but in the heart of empire, in these kind of institutional settings, what can we do? Is it a lost cause to try to work within these institutions that are channeling money to, different types of organizations, including small grassroots movements, or should we put our efforts elsewhere? Thank you so much.
All right, Salvatore, and then we pass it back to Professor Federici.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for the lecture. My question is about the opposition that the movement will get. So the movement, or the third force, as you put it, that will be maybe catalyzed, as you said, by the feminist movement, is still in its infancy. And it will probably get more and more resistance and probably violent counter-revolution as it happened in the past. So my question is, how can the movement withstand and also prepare for what is coming, and in a sense do better than previous attempt and not get divided and conquered again and smothered in the cradle?
Wow, that's okay. So I need to have repeated the first question a little bit quickly, just quickly. The first, because I remember all the others, but the first one I didn't write down. And now, can you just quick?
Yes, it was me. Now, how to center the policies around the reproduction of life by integrating the essential topics such as work, environmental issues, gender, colonialism.
Actually, I've been very inspired, by what I've seen, for example, in Argentina, where the feminist movement, perhaps, for all kinds of long historical reasons, having to do with the coup, the Pinochet, the great politicization of feminism, and have actually been able to establish, a connectivity through different type of women, different type of women's movement. Like women are fighting, labor union women. They have an intersindicale, which is women of the union, right? Who are, however, really dealing with issues particularly relating to women. They have women of the solidarity economy, and they have been able to actually have, all these assemblies more than any other movement that I've seen. And that to me is a kind of a model. Of course, I'm always scared with models, but the ability to bring together, they have been working with labor union, for example, on the question of debt, right? Having a feminist reading of the political use of debt by the powerful institution, right? IMF, the banks, the World Bank, microcredit, national debt. So they have been able to bring together, and in Latin America, you have network, Via Campesina, the MST, they have really created on the basis of common interest. For instance, there's been a whole coming together of urban movement and rural movement, indigenous women's movement and urban movement. And so I see that that potential is there. That potential is there. And the question is to have also a broad vision that connects the present struggle to the future. How doing something today actually begins to bring closer the society that we want to build. How the form of struggle anticipates the society that we want. This is very, very, very important. And of course, we need a struggle at different levels. There's a moment for the mass mobilization in the street. There's a moment for the mass takeover. And there's the moment for the change of the relation, for opposing the international division of labor, creative form of self-support autonomy, the linking from this division of labor, which is so destructive. Maria Mies spoke about even waste, as a negative commons that people have, because we don't want to build our prosperity on the misery of others. Yeah. And then I think the social media, I'm very, very, very worrisome about the social media. And I'm very, very, I think they have a role. but I think we really have to have a very severe, analysis of what are the forms of social media that are really giving us a new opening and what instead are open to destruction. And I think that I've been always really a kind of worried by the enthusiasm that many in the movements have had for the internet. It's true that the internet connects to a lot of people, as we are doing now. It is also true that it basically separates us from people. The life that are spent at the computer instead of being in the street or doing something with others, and also the fact that often we gain a false knowledge. We think that we know what is happening in another country. We think that we know because we have this internet but we don't really do the knowledge. Question of knowledge is also very important. So with great care, the social media and how to do it with care work. Same thing. I think that the question of money has been a big problem. The NGOs has been a big problem in the movement. It's clear that we cannot operate without some dependence on the system. I mean, ideally, we to a world where we have much more control over the resources, over the activities by which our lives are reproduced. But now it's clear that we are very dependent. But often, too often, money, particularly with the NGOs, has come to be a decisive element, in the political decision-making. And I think that this has become a serious problem. So, I think this is where an analysis has to be made very severe about what is the cost, what is the pro and benefit of, for example, taking money. I give you an example. In the 70s, the Black Power movement in New York, told the city of New York they was offering monies for the, children, for community. They would say, okay, you give us the money, but we organize, how a child care is run. We don't want that to have then, a say on what kind of provision we make. But so money is very corrupting. Money is very corrupting. This is a big discussion that has to take place about, in each case, what are the pros and cons. I would say it's probably better not to use, monetary means, all right? Opposition, I think, Empire Institute. So the question, I think, Salvatore, is you now, right? Or there's somebody else?
Yeah, yes, it was me, yes.
Okay, it was you. So what you're talking about the future is talking already the present. In other words, there's already a big struggle going on. And there's a lot of discussion of self-defense. But self-defense also, if I understand what is happening, is understood not only in terms of people coming together and created, popular rondas, women going out at night and making sure that they don't attack you, and defending their way, or learning karate. No, self-defense in the sense of breaking down the walls that have separated house from house, family from family, woman from woman, man from, breaking down those walls that are presented to us as the privacy. Be jealous of your privacy. That so-called privacy disempower us. In fact, to socialize our problem, to learn to collectivize, and come together with other people facing our crisis. This also gives us strength in front of the paramilitary, of the security, of all the clear attempt by the state to suffocate right? Autonomous organizing of everyday life.
That was a masterful collective response to 4 questions in just 2 minutes over time. Professor Federici, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to everyone else also for being accommodating and flexible yesterday with the change in schedule. I want to extend a special thanks to Yvonne and Mariana, who did a brilliant job interpreting into Spanish. And Professor Federici, if you might have a moment, and if you could share questions that you would like the group to consider further, I'd be really happy to pass them on, and I'm sure we'll have a lively discussion in the chat that I promise to report back on to you. So again, thank you so much.
Yeah, the question that I have is precisely that, what in the area, where you are, Indonesia or India or Germany, right? What do you see? How do you see the possibility of different movements coming together? What is holding back the possibility of coalition building? Let's take a simple example. Recently, the election in France, right? So one day, Le Pen is wincing, right? Le Pen is winning. And then the next day, we see that there is a coalition of groups. That may be a poor example, but nevertheless, the idea of creating a common ground of movements, the idea, okay, another example, in Spain, right? In Spain, after the Occupy, at the time of the Quinzeme, right? Movement decided very wisely to put aside their differences and to create a platform. A platform was, what are the points on which we agree? We may be Trotskyist and this and that, or we may be anarchist, but do we agree on wanting this, social security, and wanting healthcare, what is a platform? Beginning with the points of agreement. How easy you think this will be in the place where you are, and how do you see the possibility of bringing together people, in the place? And to what extent do you think that the movement that are operating in your ground, in your area, are actually having an anti-systemic perspective? And with that, what is your vision of the future? What is your vision of the society that you think will be a just, non-colonial, non-racist, non-exploitative society? What is the vision? Because it seems to me that this is extremely important. Clearly, from the point of disaster where we are, we cannot imagine, our imagination too is limited. And yet we have to imagine. And yet we have to imagine, right? So that imagination shapes what we do, shapes the steps that we take, shapes the strategy that we subscribe to. I would like to have those questions, right? The anti-systemic element of the everyday today response, I would like to see how much do you think that this is present in the movement that you have? That ability to shape the struggle of the day-to-day from the point of view of already beginning to incorporate in the struggle, in the form they are conducted, something of the society, some of the change that we want to see happening, and some of the society, the value of the society that we want to construct, right? And particularly this issue of the division of labor. How do we go about, organizing our struggle, our day-to-day life in a way that what we use, what we consume, what we benefit from is not at the expense of other people in the world? I spent a week in an hospital. I'm mortified. I say, fossil fuel, forget it. The hospital, the level of waste I've seen this week, in one ward in a hospital in New York is amazing. And of course, there's a justification that is safety, but it's beyond safety. It's like, I now see billions and billions of gloves every day being thrown into the garbage, billions and billions of things. And I feel this poor planet, there's no chance if we continue that way. So what is happening in your field that really gives that, you know, the change, the quality of change? That's, to me, is the most important.
Thank you so much, Professor Federici. That is indeed the central question of our time. I'm going to pose it to the others in the group. I hope it'll bring about a lively discussion. Again, we're eternally grateful for you agreeing to do this lecture. Please, our best wishes to your husband. I hope he recovers soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
we
Pavel.
will be in touch with some notes from our discussions.
Very, very good, Pavel, and very good. Thank you to all of you. I'm very, very happy. And you from Indonesia, could you send me the title? I didn't know that the book was translated. I'll be really happy to see the cover of the book. Yeah.
Yeah. I will ask the publisher to send it to you.
Yeah. Yes, that would be fantastic. All the best.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.